What happens when a desperate 6-year-old girl, protecting her dying mother, confronts a hardened hermit locked away by his own past? She asks for a space on his barn floor. She ends up demanding a place in his heart. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. We are so glad you've chosen to spend your time with us today. If you believe in the power of second chances and stories where kindness can rebuild a broken world, please consider subscribing. It's a small click for you, but it makes a massive difference for us. The dust road shimmered beneath the oppressive midday sun, the heat rising and wavering, hypnotic ribbons that blurred the line between the parched earth and the pale, endless sky. A small girl stepped forward on trembling feet, her hand clutching her mother's with all the desperate bravery her 6 years could summon. She lifted her chin toward the lone figure at the fence line. He was a tall man, his hat shadowing eyes that seemed carved from the very stone and grit of the land. "If I sweep your barn, would you let us sleep there, sir?" The girl's voice was small, but it cut through the afternoon stillness. "Mama's too weak to walk another mile." Liam Nolan's hand paused on the fence post he'd been mending. The hammer froze mid-strike. His gaze, sharp and assessing, shifted from the child's thin, sun-browned arms to the woman beside her. Her face was pale, a ghostly white beneath the grime of the road. Her body sagged, as though each breath, each step, had cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. But the child's eyes, they were bright with a terrifying desperation, yet fierce with a protective love for the woman she clung to. He had seen hunger before. He had seen weariness in the eyes of the drifters who sometimes passed this way, their faces hollowed out by the unforgiving land. Yet something about the way this small girl squared her shoulders, planting herself between her mother and the world, made his own chest ache with a dull, forgotten pain. Still, instinct held him silent. Liam was a man who had, long ago, learned the agonizing cost of letting others in. The town already whispered of his solitude. They called him stubborn. They called him strange. They cursed his pride. He'd built his fences high for a reason. "We won't be no trouble," the girl added, her voice somehow steadier than her legs. "I'm strong enough to work. I can prove it." To take in strangers, a widow with a child, it would spark talk that would stain them all. His jaw tightened, the heavy hammer lowering slowly until it hung at his side, a dead weight. The woman swayed where she stood. Her chapped lips parted as though to speak, perhaps to apologize, but no sound came. Instead, a cough shook her frame. It was a delicate, hollow, terrifying sound. She sank onto a nearby, discarded wagon wheel as if the earth itself had finally pulled her down. The girl, Lily, knelt quickly beside her, pressing her small face in her mother's sleeve, a tiny, fierce guardian. Liam's hand twitched on the hammer handle. Then it stilled. The memories rose unbidden, sharp as glass. His own mother, weary after long, thankless days, whispering lullabies in a voice as soft as worn linen. And his father's harshness, the cold, silent years of scraping by, the lessons learned with a hard hand and a bitter word. He pushed them down, burying the ache as deep as he could. "Water's in the trough," he said at last. His tone was brusque, a shield meant to hide the crack in his resolve. "You can rest a while. In the barn." The girl's face lit with a cautious, fragile hope, though the woman's eyes lowered immediately, a flush rising in her pale cheeks that spoke of a profound shame at needing charity. Liam turned away before he could see more, before that look could burrow any deeper. "This way," he grunted, and led them toward the cavernous shadow of the barn. The barn smelled of old hay, dust, and the lingering warmth of animals. Its massive beams were etched with the years of weather and work that defined his life. Dust danced in the thick shafts of sunlight that pierced the gaps in the roof, swirling around them like tiny, golden ghosts. The woman, Clara, she'd finally murmured when he'd asked her name, lowered herself onto a mound of clean straw, her movements stiff with pain and exhaustion. The girl, Lily, immediately spread her mother's thin shawl over the straw with tiny, precise hands, smoothing it as if the simple act alone could restore her mother's strength, as if love could mend a broken body. Liam returned with a tin cup of water from the pump, setting it down on an overturned barrel. "Drink," he said. The word was clipped, impersonal. Clara's hand trembled as she lifted it, whispering a thank you that barely reached his ears. He left quickly, his boots crunching loud against the packed earth, as though distance could quiet the profound unease churning inside him. He had let them in. He had broken his own first rule. That night, Liam sat alone in his star kitchen, staring at the untouched plate of beans and cornbread before him. He had let them into his barn, yet he had kept them firmly outside his life. Pride or fear? It was hard, sometimes, to tell which held him more tightly in its grip. Beyond the window, through the darkness, he could hear faint sounds from the barn. The girl humming a broken, nameless tune. The soft, restless rustle of straw. His fork hovered over the beans, then dropped to the plate with a clatter. The silence in his house, the silence he had so carefully cultivated for years, had never felt so loud. The following morning, the town saw them. Clara stood at the counter of the general store, her shoulders held straight despite the visible weariness etched into every feature of her face. She had a single coin clutched in her palm, its silver edges worn thin. With it, she bought a small loaf of day-old bread. The shopkeeper's wife, Mrs. Gable, a woman whose opinions were as sharp as her nose, looked Clara up and down, her lips pressed into a thin, judgmental line. Liam, who had come in for nails, kept his distance, pretending to study a display of harnesses. He didn't need to be close to hear the whispers. "That's the widow, the one staying at Liam Nolan's place," Mrs. Gable said, her voice pitched just loud enough for her neighbor to hear. "Showed up yesterday out of nowhere. Look at her, thin as a rail." Another woman pulled her own child closer, muttering beneath her breath. "She'll try and snare him. You watch. That's what these drifting widows do. Poor soul doesn't know what he's bringing on himself." Their words scraped at Liam's pride, burning hot and acidic in his chest. He kept his face a mask of indifference, paid for his nails, and nodded curtly to the men by the door. Yet inside, something twisted. He watched from the street as Clara tore the bread in half outside the store, carefully handing the larger piece to Lily, her fingers brushing crumbs from the child's cheek. She smiled faintly at her daughter, a ghost of a smile, though her eyes held no joy, only the sheer, grim resolve of one determined not to break. Liam found himself staring longer than he should, then forced his gaze away, ashamed of the sudden, fierce stirring in his heart. "Mr. Nolan," Sheriff Brody nodded as he passed, his badge glinting in the sun. "Heard you got company." The word was loaded. "Just passing through," Liam replied, the words tasting sour on his tongue. "Decent of you," the sheriff said, but his eyes told a different story. They were wary. "Gotta be careful, though. Never know what kind of trouble follows folks these days." "Ain't seen any trouble from them," Liam said, his voice flat. "Well," the sheriff replied, touching the brim of his hat. "See that you don't." Liam watched him go, the weight of the town's judgment settling over him like a second shadow. He glanced back to where Clara stood, her thin figure silhouetted against the harsh sun. When she caught his eye, he gave a single, curt nod, then turned and walked away. But all the way home his mind churned. He found himself wondering what had brought her to this road, what had happened to her, and why of all the farms and homesteads in this valley, she had stopped at his. That evening, when he returned to the barn to check on them, he stopped in the doorway. The barn floor, usually littered with straw and dirt, was swept clean. The empty stalls were mucked out. Even the old, dusty lanterns hanging from the beams had been polished, their glass winking in the low light. The girl, Lily, had gathered a small, brave bouquet of purple wild asters, placing them in a cracked jar by their makeshift bed. "You didn't need to do all this," Liam said, the words sounding rougher, more accusatory than he'd intended. Clara, who was refolding her shawl, looked up. Her eyes were clear, her dignity a shield. "We said we'd work, Mr. Nolan. We keep our word." Something in her simple, unbending dignity made him feel ashamed of his own hesitation, his own calculated coldness. He left them fresh water, and after a long moment's thought, he returned from his kitchen with a loaf of fresh bread and a wedge of cheese from his own stores. He told himself it was just good sense. He needed to keep them strong enough to move on. But even as he thought it, standing there in the twilight, he knew the lie for what it was. They found a moment of fragile peace, but the judgment of the outside world is closing in. It's in these quiet moments that the real battles are fought. If you're enjoying this story of quiet strength, please take a second to hit the like button. It lets us know you connect with these characters as much as we do. They slipped into one another, each one marked by small, quiet acts that seemed too humble to matter, yet somehow they did. Liam returned from the south pasture, exhausted from mending a fence line, to find his work shirt, the one with the torn shoulder, lying folded on his porch. He picked it up. The tear was gone, replaced by a line of neat, almost invisible stitches. He ran his thumb over them, a strange tightness in his chest. His tools, often left scattered by the woodshed in his weariness, were now arranged in quiet order. The axe head was cleaned, the hammer handle wiped free of mud. And then there was the sound. Lily's laughter, bright and clear as a bell, carried across the yard as she brushed down his mare, her tiny hands gripping the heavy brush with an earnest, focused effort. The horse, usually grumpy and solitary like its owner, stood perfectly still, her head lowered as if listening. None of these things were asked for. They were gifts, freely and quietly given. They were threads, weaving themselves into the coarse, lonely fabric of his solitude, and he was terrified of how easily they were taking root. One evening, he found Clara sweeping the barn floor again, her back bent, her movements slow but steady. The setting sun cast a long shadow, making her look frail, but her grip on the broom was firm. "Why do you do all this?" he asked, the question escaping before he could catch it. "Why do you help when I've given you so little?" She paused, leaning on the broom handle, and looked at him. The fading light caught the strands of her hair. "Kindness isn't a trade, Mr. Nolan. You don't offer it to get something back." She turned her gaze to the open barn door, looking out at the purple hills. Sometimes it's just what keeps us human." He opened his mouth to respond, to argue, to say something, but the words died in his throat. Instead, he just watched the light on her face, the quiet dignity in her work, and he felt something hard and cold, something he'd held inside himself for 20 years, soften and shift like ice breaking up in a spring thaw. That same night, as Lily slept soundly in the barn, Clara's cough grew worse. Liam heard it from his porch, where he sat staring into the darkness. The sound was dry, racking, carrying through the still night air. Without allowing himself to think, to second-guess, he stood up, walked to the water pump, and filled a bucket. He heated it on his kitchen stove, the one he rarely used for more than coffee. He added a handful of dried mullein leaves from a jar on a shelf, his mother's remedy. He carried the steaming, fragrant brew to the barn. Clara was sitting up, her arms wrapped around her knees. "Breathe in the steam," he said, his voice low. He set the cup before her. "It'll ease the cough." Clara looked up, her eyes wide in the lantern light, surprise flashing across her face. "Thank you." Their fingers brushed as she took the cup, and Liam felt a jolt, a sudden, unexpected warmth, run straight through him. He stepped back quickly, clearing his throat. "My ma used it," he said, as if that explained everything. "She taught you well," Clara whispered, breathing in the steam. She tried. The words opened a door he usually kept bolted shut. "My pa didn't make it easy. On her or on me." Clara nodded, her gaze full of a painful, immediate understanding. "My father was the same, quick with his fists, and even quicker with blame." The shared pain hung between them in the quiet barn. A fragile bridge, one neither of them had expected to find in this desolate place. Later that night, he found himself standing in his own kitchen doorway. It's warmer in here. No sense in you both freezing out there." The silence between them as they sat at his kitchen table was thick, yet not unbearable. They ate cornbread and beans beneath the dim, steady glow of the lantern. And though no grand words were spoken, trust, a small, cautious seedling, began to whisper between them. Lily, revived by the food and warmth, told stories of their life before. A small house in Kansas, chickens in the yard, Her father, who had died of a fever 2 winters past, who used to swing her up onto his shoulders. Clara spoke little of herself, but her eyes followed her daughter with a fierce, burning love that made Liam's chest ache all over again. "Will you tell us about your farm?" Lily asked him, her eyes wide with a child's simple curiosity. "Is it just you and the horse?" Liam, unused to being the center of anyone's attention, found himself stumbling through a description of his 20 acres. The creek that ran along the south boundary. The apple trees he'd planted by the house. Trees that had finally, stubbornly, taken root after 3 years of trying. "I'd like to see the apples," Lily said sleepily, her head drooping, as Clara gathered her up to take her back to the barn. "Come fall," Liam replied, the words surprising himself as much as them. "They'll be right by then." Only after they'd gone, after the kitchen door had clicked shut, did he realize what he'd done. He had, in essence, invited them to stay. Until autumn. Months away. The thought should have terrified him. It should have sent him running. Instead, he found himself clearing the plates, a strange, unfamiliar lightness in his chest, counting the weeks until the first fruit would appear. Yet the town did not rest. The whispers grew sharper, crueler. Liam heard them in the grain mill, at the blacksmith's forge, and outside the post office where the men gathered to smoke and talk. He shouldered the burden silently, as he always had, until the day at the rusty Spur Saloon. Liam rarely drank, but he needed supplies, and the general store was closed for the owner's daughter's wedding. The saloon sold basic goods in a back room, a clever tactic to draw men in with the promise of commerce before tempting them with liquor. He was leaving, a sack of flour tucked under his arm. The saloon was loud, filled with smoke and the harsh laughter of ranch hands. Then he heard it, a man's voice, slurred with whiskey but loud enough to carry. "Here, that widow up at Nolan's place is earning her keep, but she pays her rent on her back." Laughter spilled around the room, foul and sticky. Liam stood frozen in the doorway. Every muscle in his body went taut. He could have struck the man. He felt his knuckles ache with the raw, burning desire to do it. He saw his father's face, his father's rage, and he fought it down. Instead, he let his voice cut through the noise with a quiet, lethal steel that stilled the laughter instantly. "She's under my roof," he said, his eyes as cold as river stones. Every man in the room turned to look at him. "You'll mind your tongue, or I'll mind it for you." The silence that followed was louder than any fight. The ranch hand, a big man, half rose from his chair, then thought better of it when he met Liam's unblinking gaze. The rest of the men looked away. Suddenly, they were all fascinated by their drinks, or the floor, or the ceiling. Anywhere, but at the confrontation brewing before them. Liam left without another word, the screen door slamming shut behind him. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He wasn't a fighter by nature. Violence, to him, was a sickness, a reminder of his father. But in that moment, he'd have happily broken every rule he lived by to defend Clara's name. When Clara heard of it later, as she inevitably did, in a town where gossip traveled faster than the stagecoach, her eyes glistened. Not with shame, but with the fragile, stunned relief of someone who, for the first time in a long time, was defended rather than discarded. That night, as Lily slept, Clara lingered by the corral, the sky streaked with the fiery reds and purples of the setting sun. Liam found her there, her hair loose around her shoulders, the evening breeze tugging at the simple fabric of her dress. She looked up as he approached, startled, then lowered her gaze. "You shouldn't have spoken for me," she murmured, her voice low. "The town, they'll only think worse of you now." "Let them think what they will," Liam said, his throat tight. "I've lived under their judgment long enough. I reckon I can bear a little more." A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the hum of crickets and the soft nicker of the mare in the barn. Liam's hands, those strong, scarred hands, clenched and unclenched at his sides. "We'll be leaving soon," Clara said suddenly, the words falling between them like stones. The announcement hit Liam like a physical blow. He'd known they wouldn't stay forever. He'd told himself it was for the best. But now, faced with the reality of it, he felt a sudden, terrifying hollowness open up inside him. When, he managed to say. End of the week. I've saved enough for mending for folks in town. Enough for 2 train tickets west. My sister. She's in Oregon. She says there's work there. 3 days. 3 days before the barn would be empty again. 3 days before Lily's laughter would no longer drift through his window. 3 days before Clara's quiet, steadying presence would fade like morning mist. The thought was unbearable. I don't want you in the barn anymore, Liam said suddenly, the words breaking free before he could catch them. Rough and desperate. Clara's head snapped up, a flicker of deep hurt and fear crossing her face. We'll go, she said quickly, her voice trembling as she backed away. We'll go now, if we've worn out our welcome. No, Liam interrupted, the word raw. He stepped closer into the golden light, his face etched with shadows and a fire she'd never seen. That's not what I mean. I don't want you to leave. I don't want you and Lily hidden away in a barn like strays I've taken pity on. I want you in my life, in the house. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her hands twisted in her shawl, her eyes wide with disbelief. Wait, he said, holding up a hand. He turned and hurried to the house, his boots pounding on the porch. In his room, in a small wooden box hidden beneath a loose floorboard, lay the one thing of value he possessed. His mother's silver ring. Simple, unadorned, yet heavy with a life of meaning. He returned to find Clara still standing by the corral, as if frozen by his words. Liam Nolan, the man who had never asked for anything, sank to one knee in the dirt, awkward yet deeply earnest. He held out the ring. His hand, the one that could mend any fence and calm any animal, shook, but his voice, when it came, was steady. Clara, I can't promise riches, and I can't promise the town will ever let us be. But I can promise this. I don't want another day to pass without you beside me. I don't want this house to be empty again. Will you? Will you marry me? Her breath caught in a sob. Tears, not of sorrow or shame, but of a stunning, overwhelming relief, spilled unchecked down her cheeks. For a long moment, the world seemed to hold still. The grasses, the air, even the sun itself, pausing on the horizon to hear her reply. Then, with a trembling hand, she touched the ring. Her voice broke as she whispered one word. Yes. A small sound from the barn door made them both turn. Lily stood there, rubbing sleep from her eyes with her small fists. She blinked at the sight before her, her mother crying, the hermit on his knee. Then she gasped with a pure, childlike wonder. Does that mean we get to stay? Does this mean we get to stay forever? She asked, her voice bright as morning bird song. Liam's lips, so often pressed into a grim line, curved into a smile. A true, real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his face. He stood, pulling Clara to her feet, and then drew them both into his arms, the crushing weight of loneliness lifting from his shoulders as if it had never been. Yes, Lily, he said, his voice thick, his face buried in Clara's hair. Yes, forever. The word hung in the air, a promise he'd never thought he'd make to anyone. Yet it felt right, as if his whole hard, solitary life had been leading to this very moment. This woman, this child, this chance to build something that would outlast his own solitude. They were married by the circuit preacher the following Sunday, in the small, sun-dusted church at the edge of town. Few attended. The blacksmith and his wife, who had always been kind, were there. The schoolteacher, Miss Albright, who saw in Lily a bright and eager pupil, sat in the front pew. Sheriff Brody stood in the back, his presence seeming more a matter of duty than blessing. The rest of the town stayed away. Their absence was a statement of its own. But as Clara stood beside him in her best, mended dress, a ribbon in her hair, and a handful of wild asters in her hands, Liam found he didn't care who witnessed their vows. What mattered was the three of them, and the home they would finally build together. Later, as they walked back to the farm, their farm now, Clara's hand tucked securely in his, and Lily skipping ahead, Liam felt a peace settle over him he'd never known. The world looked different, somehow. The familiar landscape of his own land felt transformed, brighter, all by the simple, profound fact that he no longer faced it alone. I never thought I'd find a home again, Clara said softly, her eyes on Lily, who was busy chasing a butterfly. After my husband James died, I thought that part of my life was over forever. I never thought I'd find it at all, Liam admitted, his voice rough. He squeezed her hand. Thank you. Thank you for asking to sweep my barn. She laughed, a real, warm laugh that the prairie wind carried away. Thank you for saying yes. That night, the three of them shared a meal by lamplight in the kitchen. Laughter, soft but steady, wove itself into the rafters of the house that had been silent for so long. Lily fell asleep at the table, her head drooping onto her mother's shoulder. Liam carefully carried her to the small room off the kitchen, the one that had been empty for as long as he'd lived there. He laid her gently on the bed he'd built for her. Clara tucked the quilt around her, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. She's never had her own room before, she whispered as they closed the door. It's not much, Liam said, suddenly aware of the home's modest, rough-hewn offerings. Liam, Clara said, turning to him and placing her hands on his chest. It's everything. In the weeks that followed, the farm changed. It wasn't just the house, though curtains appeared at windows long bare, and rag rugs brightened the dark wooden floors. A garden took shape near the kitchen, with neat rows of beans and carrots and tomatoes stretching toward the sun. Clara's health improved, the hollow look in her cheeks replaced by a warmth that came from security and purpose. And Lily brought life to corners of the farm long forgotten, her laughter the new, constant soundtrack of their days. The town's gossip continued, but lost its sharp edge. It lost its power against the simple, undeniable reality of their happiness. Some neighbors even began to soften, particularly after Clara's raspberry preserves won first prize at the county harvest fair. It was hard to maintain suspicion in the face of such ordinary, decent joy. One evening in late September, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, Clara leaned her head against Liam's shoulder. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of cut hay and the apples from his trees. You know, she said, watching Lily chase fireflies in the growing dusk. Sometimes I think we were sent to this road for a reason, not just to find shelter for ourselves, but to bring it to you. Liam considered this, his arm tightening around her. He thought of the man he'd been just a few short months ago. Alone, guarded, a man afraid to reach beyond his own fence line. That man seemed like a stranger now. I reckon we all found what we needed, he said, his voice quiet. Later, after Lily was asleep, Liam stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the barn. It stood tall and dark against the field of stars, no longer a place of exile or a last resort, but a monument to the quiet, terrifying courage it takes to open a door. And in the quiet that followed, as Clara's steady breathing filled the room, and the moon traced silver patterns across the floor, Liam felt a truth settle deep into his bones. In a world so swift to judge, it was not pride that endured. It was not strength or solitude. It was kindness, the kind that asks for nothing in return. Love was not thunder or fire. It was a lantern steady against the dark, guiding weary travelers home. Thank you for watching. The bravest thing we can ever do is open a door we thought was locked forever. The story of Liam, Clara, and Lily is a testament to that. Would you like me to find another story about an unexpected family? Or would you prefer a tale of adventure and survival against the elements?